Okay, welcome to another North by Northwest Presents. And this is a special one. And we have Janice Wheeler back again with us. And she is going to talk to us more about my first tag and part 5 of how to get that written. So Janice, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Sandy. Good evening and welcome to part 5 of my first tag. We'll be looking at which chord notes to use for which part. For those of you that I haven't yet met, I'm a member of Pride of Portland Chorus and I serve on the faculty for Region 13 and Harmony College Northwest. I also coordinate the Region 13 Arrangers Workshop at HCNW and the tag writing contest that is co-sponsored by HCNW and North by Northwest Region 13. So tags are a part of my life. My first tag we've been doing in 6 parts, and we're ready for part 5. Which chord note to use for which part? Tonight we'll be assigning chord parts to voice parts. So far from my first tag, we've chosen a melody and words. That's what we did in part 1. Then we found the key signature and the time signature in part 2. In part 3, we found the chords for the key signature. And in part 4, we chose a chord for each melody note of my first tag. Because the chords we chose for our melody arise from the scale of the key in which the melody is written, it's referred to as the implied harmony of the composition. That implied harmony is derived from the chords of the keynote scale, primarily the triads and sevenths barbershop. And those, of course, are the chords that we found previously. The chords from related scales may or may not be added for enhancement. The chord symbols on modern sheet music the chord symbols on modern sheet music define the implied harmony of a song. So if you have a piece of sheet music that you're working with, and it's a modern piece of sheet music, which means it would most often be under copyright, it probably has chord symbols included on its manuscript, and those define the implied harmony of the song. In bass predominant barbershops, the bass part line outlines and reinforces the implied harmony. Strong chords of the implied harmony will often fall on the strong beats of measures, especially downbeat. And we learned previously that strong chords for the barbershop style include those 3 predominant chords of barbershop harmony: the major triads, the dominant 7th chord, and the dominant 9th chord. One more thing about implied harmony, the rate at which the chords usually change is usually slow. Most often no more than twice a measure, and these changes are referred to as the harmonic rhythm of the implied harmony. Very often the first note of a melody, the first downbeat of the melody, and or the final chord may be the tonic chord of the key in which the composition is written. That's the 3-note chord built on the first degree of the major scale, if you refer back to our experience in creating the chords for the key of G. So notice there the chord symbols above the melody. The first note of the composition is indeed a G chord, and the last note in the melody is a G chord. And in between are other chords of great interest. The strongest type of chord movement or progression through the implied harmony for barbershop is that in which 2 adjacent chords change from restless to at rest due to their dominant tonic relationship. And you notice there at the last 2 chords of the song, we have a 5/9 chord, or a dominant 9th chord, that resolves very nicely to the tonic note and chord of the key of G, the G major chord. Barbershop makes very frequent use of the 5/7 or 5/9 to 1 relationships in arrangement to create the tension and release pattern that's characteristic of the barbershop style. So we're right on point with our tags so far. So let's move on and decide which chord notes we're going to use for which part. We're going to be voicing the chords. From last time, we talked some about the grand staff that has both the G clef and the F clef, which is the staff that's used for manuscript with sheet music in barbershop. We also identified that in women's barbershop, we have a special bass clef symbol, and that's the bass octave clef. The little 8 on top of that clef means that the notes are to be sung an octave higher than written. And so we will be using the grand staff of women's barbershop for our work tonight. When we place the melody of My First Tag on the grand staff of barbershop so that all 4 parts are in unison, it looks and sounds like this. So everybody's singing the same note at the same time. So we're all in unison there, but we don't usually sing that way. Each of the 4 parts has a particular vocal line to contribute to the barbershop harmony. But we will be using this grand staff of barbershop as the lead sheet for voicing the chords of My First Tag. And you'll notice that on this grand staff, we have the tenor notes with stems going upward and the lead notes with stems going downward on the treble clef. And on that octave bass clef, the Bari notes are going with stems upward and the bass notes with stems downward, which is what makes it easy to read for people reading the sheet music. So the barbershop grand staff lead sheet for women's voices. The lead sheet specifies the essential elements of a musical composition and provides the format for assigning the chord notes to voice parts. So on the lead sheet, we need the melody, the lyric, the key signature, the time signature, the chord symbols for each melody note, and of course a treble clef for the tenor and the lead, and a bass octave clef for the Bari and bass. And as you can see, looking at the musical score there at the bottom of the slide, we have all those things. And we've also either created or found all those things. So they don't need to be, if they were a mystery to you in the past, they don't need to be a mystery anymore because you've actually worked everything through. If you've been following along with me since part 1. The first thing I like to do when I work on deciding voice notes for voice parts is to spell out the chord for each implied harmony chord symbol of the melody. So there above the treble clef, you can see that I've done that. G major is spelled GBD, E minor is spelled EGB, and so forth. The D7 is B F sharp AC. The D9 is B F sharp ACE, and then again we're back to G major, which is spelled GBD. And if you have any questions about those chord spellings, you can go back to the previous sessions where we found all those chords. The other thing I like to do is mark the melody notes down here below the staff, and those, we found a long time ago. So just in case you needed to refresh yourself on what the melody notes are. And then we compare the notes of the implied harmony chords with the notes of the melody to see if there are any melody notes that do not fall within the implied harmony chords. Sometimes that happens. And when that happens, it's called a non-chord tone because it's a tone that doesn't exist in the implied harmony chord. In this composition, there are none of those. So we don't need to worry about what to do in those instances. But in some compositions, it's not unusual in a long composition to find some non-chord tones that need to be dealt with. And of course, we can deal with that maybe at another time. Maybe you'll come to one of the arrangers workshops at Harmon College Northwest where we deal with those kinds of issues. So we're going to be using the chords from the barbershop chord vocabulary. There are 11 types of those chords, but not all of them are ready-made with 4 notes. And of course, we need 4 notes for each melody note that we have. So we know predominant triads are 3-note chords. So right off the bat, one of the predominant chords doesn't have 4 notes in its structure. So we'll have to consider how we're going to add a 4th note. The dominant 9th chord, another of the predominant chords, is a 5-note chord. So we're going to have to figure out how we decide which 4 notes of that 5-note chord to use. And then you'll notice there are also 3-note chords in the auxiliary barbershop chords and 5-note chords there. And in the chromatically altered, there is a 3-note chord. So we need to know what to do with those chords that don't have just 4 notes in them. And we have correct note doubling for triads, and that's the terminology that's used. We're going to double one of the notes. For major triads, we usually double the root, sometimes the 5th, and once in a while we double the 3rd for voice leading. So remembering that the root of the chord of G major is the G, and the B is the 3rd, and the D is the 5th, we know that usually we would probably be doubling the G, but sometimes we might double the D, and occasionally we might double the B. Minor triads. The rule for minor triads is that you can double either the root or the 3rd, usually. And depends on the composition, whether you double the 3rd most of the time or the root most of the time. But if we're going to double in E minor, which is one of the minor triads, E is the root of that chord, G is the 3rd, and B is the 5th. So usually we would be doubling the G or the E, excuse me, yes, the G or the E, which is the 3rd or the root, but we might sometimes double the 5th, especially if voice leading is an issue. Sorry, didn't mean to move that yet. Oh, it really wants to go there, doesn't it? And augmented triads are also 3-note chords, and you can double any note there. Very often the note that is doubled is the note that's in the melody, but that's not always the case, but very often it is. So like for the triad, because they're 3-note chords, we had to decide how to double one of the notes. For the 9th chords, which are 5-note chords, we have to know which note to drop. And there are some definite guidelines for that. The dominant 9th chord, which is one of the predominant chords of barbershop, we can drop either the root or the 5th. And if you remember the dominant 9th chord, the D is the root, F sharp is the 3rd, A is the 5th, C is the 7th, the flat 7th, and E is the 9th. And so if we drop the root, if we leave the root off, then we have F sharp, A, C, E, which is also known as F sharp minor 7 flat 5, and is the chord that's built on the 7th tone of the major scale. We can also drop the 5th sometimes. It just depends on the composition, which way would work better. And so if we're going to drop the 5th, that would be the A that we would drop from the 9th chord. For a major 9th chord, which is created on the first tone of the G major scale, for instance, we always drop the 7. So here's the root, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th. And in that case, on a major 9, we always drop the 7. So those are the guidelines. There are some voicing guidelines for voice parts also. The lead, we know, is almost always the melody, and occasionally will end up above the tenor, but mostly below the tenor. The bass is almost always the lowest note, and usually has the root or the 5th for major chords, and the root or the 3rd for minor chords. The tenor is almost always the highest note, but is occasionally below the lead. And the Bari can be either above or below the lead, and their note completes the chord. So we begin by assigning the melody to the lead part, because that the style of barbershop requires the melody to be surrounded by harmony parts. And so the melody is in the lead part, or what's sometimes called the second voice. And this distinguishes it from a lot of choral music, because a lot of choral music, the melody is in the tenor or soprano part. But in barbershop, the melody is in the lead voice, the second voice. So we're going to go on to look at a worksheet that I like to use for classes that I call the arranging worksheet for auditioning chord voicing. And the top part there is the melody that we're working with. And then we'll look closer at that, the bottom part, because that gives us kind of a summary of the 11 types of chords we have, the correct doubling and dropping for those chords, and the usual voicing guidelines. So we know that the lead has stems down on the treble clef, and it's almost always the melody. And so sure enough, that's what we have in our tag. Now we're going to add the bass notes. And one of the reasons we add the bass notes first is because the bass note, that vocal line, outlines the implied harmony of the composition. So we know we need to be using, as much as possible, the root of the chord for the implied harmony. So that's what we will do first. So the first two notes there, we have a G major chord, so we're going to double the G, and that's doubling with the lead. Now on the E minor chord, we have an E, G, B chord. Now we could have the bass jump down to an E or jump up to an E, but that's probably not in the best interest of what we call voice leading, which is the smoothness of the line of the individual part. So since we have a choice between the root and the 3rd, and very often the 3rd is considered to be the strongest choice for a minor chord, minor triad, we're going to go with the G there. The next melody note is the D. I guess I hit something I didn't mean to. The next melody chord is the D. And so we have a choice for the bass, if you recall. They are usually on the root or 5th for major chords. So since the lead already has that root, then we'll use the 5th, which in this case is the A. Because a D7 chord has 4 notes in it, and you must use all 4 of those notes in your arranging of the melody. So then we have several D7s that we have different choices we can make. When the leads go up to the A of the D7 chord, then the basses will go to the D. And for the in the D9 chord there, we have a choice. We can drop the D or the A. And I think we're going to try it with dropping the root because that actually happens quite frequently. So we have placed the bass there in the D9 chord on the A, which is the fifth of that D7, D9 chord. And then we're back to then we're back to G. So let's play that since it really wants to play, doesn't it? There's the bass. That's the bass. So let's hear that again, how the bass part sounds. Now let's hear how it sounds with the lead. Okay, so far so good. So next we'll add the tenor note. And the tenor we know have stems up on the treble clef and is almost always the highest note. So looking at the GBD chord, we have to make a decision on what we would give the tenor. The tenor in triads often gets the third, not always. But if we gave the tenors a D, it would be quite far away from the lead note. So let's try a B for the tenor for that first little. That's very sensitive tonight. So, and then for the E minor chord, we're going to give the B. We'll just keep the tenor on the B. For the D7 chord, we have an A, a D, and an A for the lead and bass. So the nearest note for the tenor out of that chord would be a C. So since the tenor line usually is very smooth compared to the other lines of the arrangement, we're going to go with the C because that makes the most sense to start with. And since the chord stays the same for the next word, the next melody note, we're going to leave it stay the same for that quarter note. And then the next note where the melody jumps up to the A, then we need to change the bass too, because we have to use every note in the 4-note chord. So we'll move but we can still keep the tenor on the C, and that would be across that measure, and then the B for the final chord. So as you can see, that makes a very smooth line for the tenor, and tenors love that, and it's good for barbershop harmony. Okay. So now let's hear how it sounds with all three of those parts together. Well, I think it still sounds so far so good. So we will next be completing the chord by adding the baritone. So we need to look at our chords so far and see what's left. What do we need to give to the baritone? So we have a G for the bass for that first chord, a G for the melody, and a B. So we obviously need a D. So we'll give a D to the baritone. In the next, in the second half of the word little, What note will we use there? Well, we're going to use the G. We're going to double the G, because if we double the E, then the bass, excuse me, then the lead and the Bari would be singing the same note. So we'd have two parts in the same note. So we generally don't do that. It's okay sometimes, but it's also stronger to double the third of a minor chord. So we're going to double that G. Then, of course, the note that's missing in the D7 chord is the F sharp. So the baritone will get that F sharp. And they're going to have the F sharps in 4 of those D chords. And then in the D9, we're going to give them the E, because the lead has the F sharp. And then they will complete the chord at the final majors with a D. So let's listen to the baritone part. And now let's listen to it, all 4 parts together. And as you can see, the highlighted area there of usual voicing guidelines at the very bottom of the slide. The Bari has stems up on the octave bass clef, and they can be either above or below the lead. And so just take a look and see, in the first chord, they're below the lead. In the second chord, they're above the lead. In the third chord, they're above the lead. In the fourth chord, they're above the lead. And then the next 3 chords, they're below the lead. And the final chord, they're below the lead. So they're mostly below the lead, but sometimes they're above the lead. And in most barbershop arrangements, it's ideal to use the baritone below the lead as much as is reasonable, because it just helps with the coning presentation of the barbershop sound. So just a mention, a lot of people like to work in arranging a composition at the piano or a keyboard. And so I've gotten a lot of questions like, how do you do that? And so here, just below the staff, I've spelled the chords as they exist in our arrangement, from the bass note to the tenor note, and then giving you some suggestions for how to use your left hand and your right hand on the keyboard for which fingers to use for each of those notes. So if you've been looking for a suggested way to use your the fingering on a piano, that's one way that people like to do it. The reason the left hand is on the bass is because that's your implied harmony, and it's also the most predominant part of barbershop. You know, we always talk about it being bass predominant. So I think it's a good idea to play the bass with the one hand and then the other 3 notes with the right hand. Gives you a good feel of the harmonic rhythm too. So we have assigned all 4 parts. And we know the chord symbols are right, and we know we've got all the right notes for all of the chords, and we voiced them according to the guidelines. One other thing we want to look at is what's known as the Roman numeral analysis, and that is kind of the shape of the composition. And remember, we said we'd like to see as many dominant 7ths and triads and dominant 9ths as possible. Those need to be predominant in barbershop. And as you can see in our tag, they are most of the chords There's only one chord that is not part of those predominant chords. So we've met that requirement for the barbershop style in spades, I think. And then another thing we want to look at is, do we have some resolutions of 5/7 or 5/9 to 1? And yes, we do. We actually have a very extended resolution from 5/7, 5/7, 5/7, 5/7, then 5/9 and 1. So we've also met that characteristic of the barbershop style too. So let's listen to it again with those thoughts in mind, and listen for the restlessness, the at rest nature of the first and the last chord, and the restlessness of the dominant seventh and ninth chords that are wanting to get right back to that restful triad. And so the last chord allows us to feel at rest, and for barbershop, that's a good thing. So next time, part 6, we'll finish our tag when we ask and answer the question, what about embellishment? We need to add some barbershop flourish and style to make this even more barbershop-like. So hope to see you next time when we'll finish this up.
Thanks so much, Janice. I hope you enjoyed part 5 of my first tag. And we encourage you to join us tomorrow at our regular time, which is 10 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time. And our North by Northwest Presents is going to have a panel of your regional management team available to answer questions and talk about our jobs and what we do for the region. So thanks again for joining us, and we will see you hopefully tomorrow morning.